Today, Russian troops are the most combat capable in the world.
The strategy you're describing is radically different from what Western media portrays.
When beer isn't delivered on Friday and NATO soldiers get depressed, we kill them in bunches. I don't see those professionals who thought they could just come kill Russians and leave happy.
I assume you've had plenty of chances to encounter Western weapons and tech on the battlefield. How would you rate their effectiveness?
Absolutely worthless.
How do you assess the Israeli army's actions in Gaza?
We fight people who fight us with weapons. We don't fight women, children, or elders. That's the difference between the Russian and Israeli armies. Plus, what kind of soldiers are you? You're fascists who deserve no respect.
Good afternoon, dear viewers. My name is Dimitri Simes Jr., and you're watching the New Rules podcast. We have a truly distinguished guest today, Lieutenant General Apti Alaudinov, hero of Russia, hero of the Chechen Republic, hero of the Donetsk People's Republic, commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, and deputy head of the main military political directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Apti Alaudinov, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Good afternoon. You're always welcome.
Right now, for obvious reasons, the world's media is focused on the battles around Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, and so on. But your troops are currently operating on the Sumy direction. Can you tell us about the situation on your section of the front and what overall trends you're observing?
Well, I'd like to note that overall, all troops of the Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense are engaged in active offensive operations across all sectors where we're positioned. And today, the most intense fighting is indeed unfolding around Pokrovsk. This sector is probably the key point where the enemy has thrown all its main forces to hold back our advancing troops. We've also chosen this as our primary direction of attack to liberate these cities and break through to operational space. In the sectors where the Akhmat Special Forces are located, we're also advancing in some areas. Our main task is to maintain an active defense, to ensure the entire front line is engaged, drawing away and stretching the enemy's resources. So we're carrying out the missions assigned to us, and we're handling them well, because every day we destroy a huge amount of enemy equipment, inflicting damage and gradually wearing them down.
You used a very interesting term, active defense. It's interesting because when we look at Western military analysts and media, they often ask, why is Russia advancing so slowly? And they argue that the slow pace of advance is supposedly a sign of Russia's weakness. But as someone who's directly involved in these battles, explain why in this conflict both sides are advancing so slowly?
Look, if we're talking about both sides advancing slowly, I want to point out that only Russia is advancing. Now, the second point, you have to look at the line of defense, the line of contact. It's over 1,000 kilometers long. And across this entire 1,000-kilometer line, we're conducting active offensive operations in various sectors, destroying the enemy's resources in the process. If you take into account that the forms and methods of warfare have changed today, the main damage the enemy inflicts on us, and we on them, is done by unmanned aerial vehicles. Does it make sense for us to make sudden moves and lose a lot of people? Of course not. We're advancing steadily, gradually eroding and destroying the enemy's forces and assets. And today, we can say we've brought them to a state where they're about to crumble. But if we'd made a sharp breakthrough and surged forward, we'd have lost a huge number of people. Should we consider that a victory? No, because the situation shows we need to preserve our personnel as much as possible, keep advancing without giving the enemy a breather, but at the same time, we have to be ready for NATO forces to join the conflict at any moment. If we'd made that dash, spent a lot of resources and manpower, and then NATO decided to oppose us, we'd be in a position where our resources are depleted while NATO steps in to help Ukraine. We'd automatically end up on the losing side. Today, Russian troops are the most combat capable in the world, with the most extensive combat experience. And we're not fighting the Ukrainian people, We recognize that. This is a proxy war through Ukraine, where NATO is fighting us, so it doesn't make sense for us to make sharp thrusts and movements and take heavy losses. It's much more advantageous to grind down the enemy's resources, making them tremble and start to fall apart, which is exactly what's happening now.
I'd like to emphasize that last point. You said you're seeing signs that the enemy is starting to crumble.
Of course.
What exactly are those signs? How do they manifest?
Look, we don't have to go far for an example. Take Pokrovsk. We remember a month ago when everyone was saying, including Zelensky, that everything was fine with them. When they were offered peace, they said no, they were ready to defeat Russia, and everything was great. Literally 1 or 2 months after they made that statement and rejected negotiations, even those proposed by Trump, we see the results. Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, and the whole agglomeration are gradually falling apart. Don't our viewers, Russian, American, and worldwide, see that Russia liberates at least 1 or 2 settlements every day? On that direction, we free 1 or 2 every day. The same on other sectors. Our line of contact isn't static. We're pushing in everywhere, liberating here and there. We're forcing the enemy's resources to stretch constantly. They're stretching, trying to hold here, hold there. Of course, NATO has provided massive help in weapons, equipment, everything possible. At the same time, we see that even with all these resources, Ukraine can't hold the front anymore. That's the answer to your question.
But you mentioned Western support. Since the beginning of this year, have you seen changes in the quantity and quality of Western support that the Ukrainians are receiving?
Look, it's the simplest thing. Huge numbers of drones. Today, both America and all of NATO are testing all their modern drones, weapons, equipment, electronic warfare systems on Ukraine. We see that NATO is testing all the armaments they're producing now through Ukraine, and we feel it on the front. Huge amounts of drones, huge amounts of equipment that we destroy daily. Ukraine doesn't produce all this itself, so this equipment keeps arriving constantly. Today, Trump made a move where he says, I won't fund Ukraine, but at the same time, he sells weapons produced by America for money from European NATO countries, and that weaponry still ends up on the front. Of course we feel it. Of course we feel the strikes deep into Russia by unmanned aviation, and just recently we witnessed them trying to hit Voronezh with ATACMS. If there weren't informational and other direct help from America and NATO, how could they even strike? How could they operate those drones deep in our territory? They couldn't.
In other words, the administration changed in America, but the intensity of support for Ukraine hasn't decreased.
Well, look, I have this feeling, and I've said it before and I'll repeat it now. Trump says one thing, then another. And it seems like he's not even in control of himself anymore, because he wants to say, that's it. I'll stop this war in 1 day. Then he says, I'll give 60 days, and nothing comes of it. His rhetoric is just, if Trump had issued an ultimatum and told Ukraine, wait, you end this war on the terms we accept now, the war would be over. Without American weapons, without American think tanks, without American satellites, what would even NATO do? Nothing. That's the answer to your question. Trump says one thing but does something else entirely.
I definitely want to discuss NATO's role in Ukraine with you in more detail. But first, I'd like to talk about drones. Because now, naturally, drones are called the kings of the battlefield. They say drones have completely changed military tactics and strategy. What role do more traditional forms of weaponry like artillery, aviation, and infantry play?
Well, look, if we're talking about the forms and methods of warfare changing, then yes, we have to understand that today the main emphasis on the battlefield has shifted to unmanned aviation. At the same time, of course, thinking that artillery is extinct or tanks, which are still needed on the battlefield, are obsolete. But today, there can't be tank offensives where entire tank armies advance. The tactics of warfare have completely changed because a tank worth millions of dollars can be destroyed by a drone that costs $500. We have to understand that behind every war is economics, and if a state can't economically sustain the war, it automatically loses. So we can't respond to a missile worth millions of dollars with missiles that also cost millions. We need to use resources that cost much less, or take a small drone drone that costs $500. It can destroy any complex worth tens of millions. So we had to rethink the forms and methods of warfare to economically ensure the destruction of enemy resources. There's no secret here.
But even if we step away from the context of the special military operation, people often say now that drones are democratizing warfare, narrowing the gap between great powers that can afford advanced aviation, lots of tanks, artillery, and smaller groups that just make cheap drones.
Absolutely correct. That's spot on. I've said this today and I'll repeat it. Of course, the democratization on the world stage today comes from weapons like Russia's Kinzhal and Zircon, America's famous carrier strike groups which terrified the world, pulling up next to any country and defeating it with the power on those carriers. Today, any carrier can be sunk by one Kinzhal or one Zircon. So in a war with Russia, American ships are no longer a power or a force. Drones have changed the balance of forces and means in the same way. There's that cold quote, God made men strong and weak, and I made them equal. Drones do the same for states today. A state with stronger drones can conclude that tanks, artillery, and other weapons aren't as crucial anymore.
Getting back to the special military operation, who has the advantage in drones right now? And how does it show?
Today, I'd say, even though Ukraine is helped by all of NATO, the advantage in drones is on Russia's side.
And how does that advantage manifest?
It shows in the fact that Russia has a fully layered drone system for deep reconnaissance, strike drones with different warhead levels, flight ranges, maneuverability, and accuracy. There are many criteria. We can operate purely with Russian-made drones from the closest sectors to the farthest.
How quickly is this technology developing? For example, what targets can you hit today that were inaccessible or hard to reach a year ago?
All targets. Today, all targets. Our long-range drones can even destroy moving targets. Literally 2 years ago, Russia was probably just at the beginning of this development, while Europe had already supplied Ukraine with modern drones at that time. Now our drones are so advanced that in many ways we're head and shoulders above all of NATO's unmanned aviation.
What opportunities does this technological advantage give you in planning operations, both for offense and defense?
It's no secret. According to analysts, not ours, Ukraine loses 40,000 people on the front every month. 40,000. And they can only mobilize 25,000 a month. So every month, Ukraine's manpower shrinks by at least 15,000, even with year-round mobilization. With our drones, especially our well-developed unmanned reconnaissance, we get serious intel that helps us detect and destroy the enemy maximally effectively. That's why we don't need to rush large offensives, because we'd take huge losses disproportionate to the results. We're actively improving our drones, and that's how we're achieving these outcomes.
I recall the Kursk operation in which you were directly involved, and we followed what happened in January, February, and early March. There were tons of videos from that front showing Russian forces systematically destroying various Ukrainian armored vehicles and supply trucks trying to support Ukrainian troops in Kursk. At first, it didn't seem backed by major offensives, but after creating the so-called Road of Death, everything moved quickly.
There's your example. We prepared Operation Potok, cut off all the roads they needed for logistics. That way, we destroyed a huge enemy grouping without heavy losses. I consider that smart warfare. Why take big losses when we can smartly organize the destruction of a sector, wipe out the forces there, and liberate such territory with minimal losses? That's what we're doing today around Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. We're seeing the same picture there now.
The strategy you're describing is radically different from what Western media portrays. They love to say Russia relies primarily on so-called meat assaults. Does that match reality?
Look, let the Western audience check what mobilization has been like in Ukraine. It hasn't stopped once in these 4 years. Russia conducted only one mobilization, calling up 300,000 people. And let them explain how we've been fighting for 4 years and still conducting offensives with such small forces without major mobilization. You can tell fairy tales to yourself. But if we're talking truth, Russia did one mobilization and is still advancing. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army, which hasn't stopped mobilizing for 4 years, is still losing. So whose tactics are better?
Fair point. But I have this question. It's no secret that Ukrainians have manpower issues. Western media writes about it, Ukrainians complain about it themselves. Yet the front isn't collapsing. Why can Ukrainians still hold defenses despite real manpower problems?
If you look at their whole front, you'll see that behind the people they mobilize, catching them like dogs on the street and throwing them to the front, are nationalist formations that shoot them for retreating anywhere. You can see it online. If they try to retreat, they're killed, even with drones. These are punitive forces that don't let them fall back. And now another question. If we're talking about why the enemy's front isn't crumbling yet, as you say, if you remove NATO behind the Ukrainians' backs, how many days would that front last? The endless influx of equipment, gear, drones, everything to keep Ukraine from losing, still lets them stay afloat. But the panic in Ukraine today, I'm sure, will soon lead to Zelensky's replacement. Why? Realizing Russia can't be stopped, they're trying to push negotiations on us to halt the war, then replace Zelensky and his team, retrain Ukrainian troops. That already shows it's a tragedy there. Do you think America or Europe didn't know Zelensky is a thief, that his team steals hundreds of millions? They knew perfectly well. But only now they are pulling the corruption card. Umerov ran to America to testify against Zelensky's team. It's all meant to bring us to negotiation terms, to stop us. I think that's the answer to how we're advancing and whether the enemy's front is crumbling.
Since we're on the topic of NATO support, including NATO equipment, I assume you've had plenty of chances to encounter Western weapons and tech on the battlefield. How would you rate their effectiveness?
Absolutely worthless. If you look at the money this tech costs, I think it doesn't match the sums paid at all. Meanwhile, basic Russian equipment is far better adapted to combat conditions in Russia and Ukraine. Much more effective than any Western tech, no questions there. And of course, if we're talking about long-range artillery...
HIMARS, for example.
No, artillery, I said. For example, the M777, a 155mm gun, good piece, but very limited resource for accurate fire, and HIMARS. Okay, they're very expensive, fine. You've given Ukrainians HIMARS Storm Shadow. What haven't you given them, and what changed? Nothing really on the front. What you give them costs a fortune. Yes, it's for laundering big money. Yes, the people producing these weapons, America's military-industrial complex, get very rich. But what changed on the front today? Nothing. At first, they scared us with lethal weapons, gave javelins. What did that change? Absolutely nothing. Javelins proved unsuitable for our conditions. Then ATACMS, M777 artillery, Storm Shadow. What haven't you given them, and what did it change? For a brief moment, we had some issues somewhere, but within a month, it turned into a minus for the troops fighting us.
And how do NATO tactics show themselves? Because Ukrainians not only fight with NATO weapons, they're trained by NATO instructors. And basically, there's an attempt to adopt NATO military doctrine. How effective has that approach been?
Ukraine is fully fighting with NATO's approach, training, satellites, think tanks, and using everything NATO has. Ukraine is losing today. Do I need to answer that question?
Well, maybe just a clarifying one. What were the shortcomings? Why what worked in Iraq and Afghanistan doesn't work here? Where exactly did those flaws show?
Okay, I'll answer. Why didn't the Americans and NATO, when planning war against us, calculate that Russia is a nuclear power? Russia is a state with colossal combat experience. Russia is ready to fight for its sovereignty to the end. And Russia has a president named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And God loves Russia. That's what the Americans and NATO didn't account for when starting this war. We're not those guys in sandals with Kalashnikovs from last century. We're a state with highly developed military power. Today we have missiles no other country has. That's why NATO tech, including American carriers, are just tin cans now. One Zircon missile can sink any tin can called an American carrier. When you don't account for all that, you have to understand your power, which is terrifying for the states you've conquered and broken so far. What about Iraq? Libya, Syria, we're incomparable in spirit, strength, or power. That's what they should have considered, but they didn't.
Besides this attempt to mimic NATO in doctrine and tactics, We've also seen over the past nearly 4 years many NATO Army veterans coming to fight for Ukraine as mercenaries. How do these mercenaries perform on the battlefield? How effective is their experience and approach in these conditions?
They came to fight Russia thinking it'd be a safari like in Africa, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. We killed them in bunches. And it's no secret. We destroy the enemy without asking whose passport they have. We don't care if it's American or whatever. Today we've shown that these mercenaries who came to fight us took such losses that most have fled Ukraine. I don't see those professionals who thought they could just come, kill Russians and leave happy.
Are they more or less effective than Ukrainian soldiers?
Look, I'll say one thing. If comparing by spirit, I can swear that after the Russian army, the strongest soldiers are Ukrainians, and I'd rate them higher in spirit than the rest of NATO's soldiers. That's real. Ukrainians are ready to stand to the death, and they do. I wouldn't say that about NATO. When beer isn't delivered on Friday, NATO soldiers get depressed. Ukrainians don't have that. They're just like us Russians.
I read your interview from October 2023, where you talked about Israeli mercenaries leaving Ukraine. I admit I didn't know about their presence. Can you tell us who these Israeli mercenaries were and what they were doing there?
Basically, the Israeli mercenaries we're talking about are a projection of America. Wherever America is, Israel is, and vice versa. That's no secret to us. Israeli mercenaries, like others from NATO, were in Ukraine fighting Russia. They realized it's no safari, and they bailed home too. To us, they're nothing more than other mercenaries. Can't say they're incredible specialists. Yes, they're specialists where they kill unarmed women, children, elders. They're strong warriors. But fighting Russia, sorry, I didn't see their power or strength.
Since we're on Gaza, as an expert in urban combat, how do you assess the Israeli army's actions in Gaza? How does their tactics differ from Russia's in the special military operation?
Does Israel have tactics? Israel is a fascist state. No tactics when Israel uses American-made bombs and missiles to kill tens of thousands of women, children, elders. Is that tactics? No, wait, we're fighting Ukraine. If you've seen us fight like that anywhere, then compare us. Israel has no combat tactics. They destroy everything in front of them, sparing no women, children, or elders. That's not tactics. I'll repeat, it's the absence of any tactics.
Interestingly, when we look at what Israel supporters say, their argument is that, unfortunately, you can't fight any other way in such a large city with ongoing battles. The only way is to bomb everything and destroy around. You have urban combat experience too. Is that argument really valid?
That's nonsense. That argument means nothing. I liberated 36 settlements in the Luhansk People's Republic with Akhmat Special Forces, including major cities like Rubizhne, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. Go there and see if they're destroyed like Gaza's cities. Did we kill tens of thousands of women, children, elders? No. We fight people who fight us with weapons. We don't fight women, children, or elders. That's the difference between the Russian and Israeli armies. There, it's women, children, elders, hiding behind supposed militants somewhere. But sorry, if you can't fight those militants and instead kill the entire Palestinian people, what kind of soldiers are you? You're fascists who deserve no respect. So I don't think the Russian army compares to the Israeli one at all. We not only don't kill women, children, elders, we even try to spare our enemies' lives. If you look me up online, you'll see I always order my fighters, if possible, take them prisoner alive, don't kill them, even our enemies. But the Israelis kill tens of thousands of women, children, elders, and say they can't do otherwise. In that case, they shouldn't fight. Just go home and live their lives, not torment people, not torment or kill a whole nation.
Since we're discussing the competence of Israel's armed forces, you said a few months ago that Trump saved Israel from defeat against Iran. That's the opposite of the Western mainstream view. They say Israel came, bombed everything loudly, and showed superiority. Why did you conclude Israel was on the brink of defeat in the war with Iran?
I'll answer. Israel prepared a very good operation, I agree. Their agents struck Iran hard initially by killing much of the country's military leadership. In those pinpoint strikes, Israel did well. They bribed people, set up cells, they hit anti-missile systems. That was done well. But if you remember the chronology, after that strike, what does Netanyahu do? He addresses the Iranian people. Worthy residents of Iran, Iranian people, we are not your enemies. We did this and that, and you must rise and overthrow your leadership. Instead, the Iranian people united became one. All those Israeli agents were arrested, executed, and on top of that, Iran launched a missile strike that completely destroyed the Iron Dome, which they claimed nothing could penetrate. Strikes hit Israeli cities. If it continued, believe me, the Israeli people would have taken to the streets and devoured Netanyahu. And Trump jumped into the war, supposedly dropping 3 deep bombs on Iran's basalt mountains, destroying their nuclear program. Then everyone went home as winners. Trump said, "I stopped the war, I'm the winner." Israel said, "We defeated Iran, we're winners." Iran said, "We're winners because we forced Israel to admit they prepared an operation they didn't win. We breached their Iron Dome, damaged their cities, made them drag in their master America to defend them." Trump pulled Israel out of shame. He helped Netanyahu escape so the Israeli people wouldn't rise and say, "You're done, Netanyahu, we're not following you." The people were ready. Unrest started on the streets. People began protesting against Netanyahu. So Trump saved Netanyahu and Israel from disgrace. That's why when we hear things twisted, putting it all upside down, we see how they talk about how bad Russia is. Russia wants to attack everyone. But Russia said for years, "Leave us alone after 1991 or when the Berlin Wall fell." There was an agreement that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. But all these years, NATO moved east. You gradually took states around Russia, violating all agreements. When Putin gave his Munich speech in 2007, what did he ask? Don't violate the agreements we made. Don't cross red lines. No one listened. 8 years of Minsk talks. After they failed, because Russia was forced to start the special operation, Merkel and Hollande left office and said on air they deceived Russia for 8 years to give Ukraine time to prepare for war with Russia. Wait, where's the justice? Where's the truth? America and Europe have so many masks we can't see anything human behind them. In these states' politics run by the deep state that controls everything, we can't see justice or truth. So we have to listen. You watch and think, oh, how scary we are. But really we say one thing, leave us alone. We don't want war, but if you don't, we'll fight to the end. And I'll repeat Putin's words. Why do we need a world without Russia? If there's no Russia, believe me, there'll be no America or Europe, guaranteed. They need to hear that. But we don't want war. We want peaceful lives. We're masters of 1/6 of Earth. We have enough land, all resources on our territory. We're not fighting for a piece of Ukraine. We're fighting for our sovereignty. And when it's about our sovereignty and NATO missiles at our fence, 500 kilometers from Moscow, we'll go to the end. So those telling fairy tales about Israel, us, Iran, China, stop. Or it'll go too far. Why does America defend Israel so fiercely? I'll answer. Right now, America and Europe care about Israel because Epstein, who bought an island as a Mossad agent, set up conditions where all presidents, billionaires, statesmen from those countries came, engaging in pedophilia. They brought boys and girls from 5 years old, raped and killed them, all recorded on video. In Epstein's files. All these people are hooked by Mossad, by Israel. That was the biggest operation Mossad and Israel ran in America and Europe. Today, you do whatever they say. You give them anything because your leadership is fully compromised. The day they say no, they know those files will be published and they'll be swept away. That's politics. The deep state runs everything as it wants. And the deep state mainly consists of people from that state. Don't make us the monsters, predators, when your states are run by real Satanists who've turned from God, real pedophiles who've lost all moral decency. That's the whole problem.
On that powerful note, I'd like to thank you, Apti Alaudinov, not only for the detailed breakdown of the special military operation, but also for analyzing warfare in the 21st century and discussing Israel, Gaza, Iran, and the U.S. in depth. So thank you very much for making time for us. And to our audience, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share with friends. If you're into deep geopolitical analysis, subscribe to New Rules Geopolitics on Telegram and on X. Thanks. See you soon.